1 year ago, I made a video detailing the lonely world of the Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, and now, a year later, I found a similar sense of melancholy in another Zelda title. Majora's Mask is quite evidently a lonely game taking place in a world on the brink of destruction, as is Breath of the Wild, with its world having already experienced a destructive event. One could even argue that Wind Waker's bright world is quite lonely, as it's comprised of segregated islands and most of its inhabitants live in solitude. However, I've been thinking of the Zelda title that's perhaps the least expected to be brought up in a video about loneliness, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Yes, this game has perhaps the most lively cast of characters in the series, and sure, it also has some of the most upbeat, quirky, and empowering music tracks, but though at both its surface and core this title may not contain a tone as melancholic or simply downright depressing as Twilight Princess's or Majora's Mask's, it's still far more lonely than I had ever initially realized. The bright, welcoming colors, expressive characters, and oftentimes calming art style presented in Skyward Sword can easily distract from the fact that its pre-Hyrule world is riddled with a sense of separation, from its deepest caverns to its greatest skies. Let me explain why that is. Every major area of this game is faced with some degree of segregation or loneliness, so I figured it'd be best to just discuss them in the order that they're encountered. In that case, let's first talk about the lush Faron province. Upon arriving at this massive wooded subset of the game's world, the players first met with the Sealed Grounds. A rather oddly shaped chasm lies in the center of this area where the imprisoned, essentially a manifestation of evil, remains shackled. This area, being one of the first the player encounters upon reaching the surface world, is already quite desolate. However, it also contains the Sealed Temple where an old lady by the name of Impa watches over the imprisoned, alone in perhaps the most dangerous corner of the world. The Sealed Grounds proves to be a very gloomy onset for this adventure, although that changes when the next areas, Faron Woods and the Deep Woods, are encountered. These two areas are filled with lively vegetation, insects, friends, and foes alike. Unlike the Sealed Grounds, the greater portion of the Faron province actually feels quite alive and friendly, and it is. The music is quite relaxing, as are the bright colors of the woods in comparison to the dull, desaturated ones of the Sealed Grounds. Despite this welcoming nature, however, there's still one example of loneliness in this area, which is linked to the native race of Faron Woods, the Kiwi. These little, or big, creatures are very friendly things, however very few of them are ever seen. Their population is very scarce, presumably due to the race being in an early developmental state, as Skyward Sword does take place very shortly after Hylia's world was created. Not only are the Kiwi limited in numbers, but also in territory. They're confined solely to Faron Woods, as their timid nature prevents them from expanding their influence. Even the Deep Woods, which are only slightly more hostile than where they reside, is entirely devoid of Kiwi. Just as this cowardly species has never migrated to the Deep Woods, the Kiwi have also never been seen at Lake Floria, the last major sub-area within Faron. Although this time they do have the excuse of being presumably unable to swim, as even when their woods are flooded, they refuse to make contact with the water. Exploring Lake Floria, or even the flooded woods of Faron, however, reveal that the Kiwi, while alone, aren't alone in being alone. The Pirella are another native species to Faron, though these squid-like creatures survive best in water, and so they too, despite appearing quite capable of surviving against many threats thanks to their skillful swimming abilities, remain confined to Lake Floria. And while more plentiful than the Kiwi, this species is again a scarce one. Within just this first province, it's already clear that contrary to most other titles where Gorons travel to all provinces of Hyrule, and Zora can be found in areas other than their native homeland, the few races in this game are largely bound to wherever they originated from, not yet evolved or knowledgeable enough to explore new lands. While it's clear that they seem rather content with where they're at, aside from the Kiwi on occasion, because again, they're cowards, it's very sad to see that these races are unable to explore other provinces like their further developed descendants do in later titles. The next province explored by the player is another that contains a race solely confined to their homeland. although surviving in the scorched land of Eldin is much more difficult than in Faron. The Mogma, a species of subterranean mole-like creatures, have evidently adapted to their home by the time the player arrives. They're able to freely dig through the hard earth to get wherever they please, whether it be the base of Eldin Volcano or its searing summit. They've even made it a habit to occasionally burrow into the Earth Temple and Fire Sanctuary, two massive fortified structures in search of treasure. Being the sly species they are, the Mogma are also easily capable of avoiding the monsters which recently invaded their province, at least most of the time. Their explorative nature doesn't change the fact that they're still both low in numbers and confined to the Eldin province, however. While they're certainly the species I could see adapting to other provinces with the smallest amount of issues, it's quite clear that they're still unable to do so. I mentioned the Earth Temple and Fire Sanctuary earlier, and I'd like to bring them up again. The Faron province contained two dungeons similar to these ones in the form of Skyview Temple and the Ancient Cistern. And while the latter's correlation to both Buddha and a short story known as the Spider's Thread prompts some questions as to its purpose, these two structures seem to fit rather nicely with their surroundings. Skyview Temple, given its name, was presumably built to view the sky. Perhaps it was a place to worship gods above, and the Ancient Cistern, while again being a very questionable piece of architecture, could have been used for the same purpose. The cistern is also directly linked to Lake Floria and partially filled with water, meaning it may be a sacred building to the Perella race. Regardless, such a beautiful structure being placed in an equally beautiful area with a race of aquatic beings living nearby makes enough sense to me. What doesn't, however, is the strange placement of Eldin's two dungeons. The Fire Sanctuary looks as though it could be a place of worshipping, but it's at the highest point on Eldin Volcano where practically no one can reach aside from the Mogma, who couldn't have built it or the Earth Temple because they admit to not knowing their way around these structures and only visit them in search of riches. These two dungeons had to have been built and abandoned by an unknown race or entity. Regardless of their history, however, one thing is for certain. The fact that the only known race native to Eldin knows nothing about these clearly important structures adds to the melancholic nature that is the existence of the undeveloped races. It feels as though there should be more context or more evident species in this province, but there simply isn't. There's not but a single lonely race whose own homeland still remains a mystery to them. I can admit that some of these ideas I've been presenting have been stretches, and to some people these worlds may not appear nearly as lonely as I'm making them out to be, but there's one area in this game that no one can deny the depressing nature of. The Lanayru province consists of an expansive desert, a vast network of mines, chasms, and gorges, and an endless sea of sand. Its natural beauty and rich ecosystem stripped from its earth, this dead region is undoubtedly the loneliest in the game, and every aspect of it conveys that. The Time Stones, technological creations made with the purpose of manipulating time, show what this province once was, an admirable expanse of green and a boundless sea of blue, upon which rested an archipelago within which sat many different islands, before reminding the player of what it's become, a monotonous hellscape. From the music, which is unlike the cheery or goofy sounding tracks of the other provinces and instead minimalistic and somber, to the monochromatic visuals showcasing the land which was drained of all life it once had, every second spent in Lanayru serves to express how lonely this world can be. This particular province, in fact, contains no native natural race, save for enemies, of course. The timestone technology present within it had to have been created by someone or something, however. That thing is the ancient robots, or the group of ancient robots. These sentient machines were quite flexible, able to perform a variety of activities, from mining and transporting materials to manning entire ships. This impressive, though non-biological race was able to create a very advanced civilization. They were responsible not only for the ability to witness Lanayru as it once was, but also for the creation of the Sand Ship, a commendable vessel which sailed the once glorious seas, and the managing of the Lanayru mining facility, an equally impressive structure which produced many of the technology seen in the province. It's not implausible to assume that they also played a role in the building of the Temple of Time located at the far end of Lanayru Desert, as the Lanayru mining facility has an exit directly to the temple. These robots were an extremely impressive race, but like the others, were only found in Lanayru. I've also been using the past tense when referring to them because, like all else in the province, they were lost to the passage of time. While their own technology can revive them for short periods of time, in the present, the machines lie defunct, hopelessly doomed from the moment of their creation, regardless of how versatile they once were. And even when they are alive and interacting with Link in the past, they're still in the past, and are unable to notice the devastated state of their home, which rests at times just a few feet in front of them. At first, this may not pose much of an impact on the player, as they were just normal robots which made the occasional mechanical noise between sentences. However, it soon becomes clear that though they were created by some entity, they had their own emotions and personalities. Skipper, the most notable individual of the race, was actually a character I grew attached to, and at one point, on a quest to obtain a sea chart from his home, his dismantled family can be found buried under mounds of sand, as can pictures of his crew aboard the once functional sand ship, and, most notably, a note from his son reading, "Dear Dad, good luck at work." These individuals were robots, but they were sentient, and they were individuals. While the Magma, Perella, and Kikwi are struggling to survive and expand, the race with the most potential out of all of them had already went extinct due to the declining nature of their homeland. Lanayru, far more than the rest, is a truly great example of how lonely this developing world is. While there is one last major area I'll be discussing soon, there are a few more aspects to the surface world that I'd like to mention. The first of which being the Goron tribe. Unlike the other surface races in the game, the Goron are the only ones that actually appear in games further down the timeline, and so presumably they're the only race that actually survived, as the Kikwi, ancient robots, Perella, and Magma are never seen past Skyward Sword. This is interesting to me as only 3 Goron appear in the game and they never once interact with one another. Gorko first appears in the Sealed Grounds and then proceeds to travel the world, meeting up with Link in various different areas. Golo is found in the Lanayru Caves attempting to dig a tunnel to Lanayru Gorge, which he does eventually complete, and the last Goron, Gortrum, is found alone at the Lanayru shipyard. It's very peculiar that only 3 are encountered and aren't even located in the same areas. Gorko is also practically the only character in the game to travel to different regions of the surface, aside from Link. But the Goron aren't the only race in Skyward Sword where only 3 individuals are seen, as shocking as that may be. There are also the 3 dragons, named after the 3 provinces of the surface. These gargantuan creatures are tasked with watching over their respective provinces, and while this may explain the purpose of some of the dungeons mentioned earlier, perhaps being built by the dragons, their minimal presence in the game, just as with the Gorons, adds to the lonely feel. One last thing to note before discussing the final province is that no single race in this game has a home village or town or anything of the sort. In later titles, the Goron have their own city, the Rito their own island, and the Korok their own settlement in a forest, but that's not the case here. The closest thing to a settlement in this game is Skipper's house, or just Lake Floria as a whole. At least on the surface world, that is. Above the surface, however, things are quite different. The game is called The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword for a reason, so I suppose I should finally mention the last province, the skies above the surface. While all of the races of the surface live unaware of each other's existence, the Hylians live in the clouds, most unaware of the surface world entirely. Not only is the sky separated from the surface, but even the sky as a whole is separated into islands, many of which are devoid of life, while those that aren't particularly lively either. Bamboo Island contains one resident who runs a minigame, as does Fun Island. Pumpkin Landing contains a tavern where numerous individuals go to relax, but it's still has a segregated, solitary feel to it. There's also Beetle's Island, where Beetle, unlike all of the other Hylians who have houses on Skyloft, the largest island in the sky, lives alone. He resides on Skyloft during the day, but can be found on his island at night, separated from everyone else. Skyloft itself, being the only settlement in the game, is far more lively than anywhere I've talked about previously, but it's not entirely normal either. Housed in Skyloft, hidden to all who live there, is the Sky Keep, a dungeon built into the island with the purpose of housing the Triforce. The Sky Keep is another example of how the residents of Skyward Sword's world live with no or very limited knowledge of their homes. Just as the Mogma live unaware of the purpose of the two massive dungeons built into their home, the Hylians live with this pivotal keep built right under their noses. It's astounding how insignificant this game's world is able to make its races feel. Despite how intelligent, adaptable, or versatile they may be, they can't yet escape the lonely nature of their world, whether on the sky or the surface. The world of The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, while appearing far cheerier and brighter than those of some other games in the series, has a lot of loneliness that can be difficult to initially locate. That's because it's a different kind of loneliness than in the other titles. While Breath of the Wild's forlorn feeling is derivative of its post-calamity world, and Twilight Princess's disconnection is largely due to the layout of its world, Skyward Sword's feeling of loneliness comes from the fact that both its segmented areas and its numerous segregated races are at very early stages of development. The species of this world have very little in the way of connections, even when they're spaced together as closely as the Kikwi are to the Pirella. Not only are these races unaware of the existence of other tribes, but are even unaware of certain features of their own homes. The aforementioned Kikwi are a doomed species, as they don't even bother to stray from the small sector of woods they reside in. The Pirella are stuck in their lake unless another flood happens. The Mogma, while clearly capable, are still too busy trying to uncover all that their native land has to offer, and the ancient robots, as advanced as they were painfully unaware of the rapidly declining state of their home. With all of my speculating, rambling, or whatever you'd like to call it out of the way, I'd like to end by saying this. Regardless of what anyone thinks in regards to this game's world, I think it's very impressive on the developers' part to have created a game that could be seen as so cheerful and optimistic, but also equally as lonesome and melancholic. Not only with Skyward Sword, but just about any and every game in the series. Thank you all so much for watching.